Hello everyone, I am editing this video on the concepts of reliability, validity, and fairness. It's part of the two modules on the large-scale testing and test prep. It's important to be able to speak intelligently about these terms. Some are also part of your vocabulary in your own words, and a quiz located in this module. You won't receive a quiz on fairness, but you should know what it means. Many of you use these terms very loosely without really knowing the difference between them. Just go into any faculty room and hear people talk about how our state tests are not fair to kids from poverty without really knowing how do you determine fairness. The quote-unquote big idea is that before you can make a valid inference about test results, the assessment must be reliable, valid, and fair. You can see by the title that for a test to be valid, it must be reliable. Conversely, if a test is valid, you can be sure it's reliable. So chew on that for a while. This presentation will be longer than my others, so I would recommend taking breaks in between the sections. You should take out your vocabulary and your words. Several terms will be mentioned in this presentation. One of the big ideas of testing is reliability. Simply put, reliability equals or means consistency. Some also look at it as a form of stability of the test, but I would stick with the consistency definition. If the tests we create are not getting consistent results, then it really doesn't matter what we are testing. We won't be able to make valid inferences about what students know. I have listed the formal definition here, which really describes one form of reliability, the first type we will discuss in a little while. According to the standards of educational and psychological testing, consistency of a test measurement when the testing procedure is repeated on a population of individuals or a group. That is test-retest reliability, which is the major form of reliability, which you should all be familiar with. As you can tell from the graphic, giving the same test twice to the same group of individuals, you should get very similar results. Of course, nothing of significance could have taken place between administrations, like students going home and looking up the answers, and it's also important to have a short period of time between the two testings. So, are you going to do that with your test? Of course not. That would be a complete waste of time. Alternate form liability is another form of liability, one that you should be familiar with. It's important if an assessment consists of two more forms, like the SATs or the GREs, which have many forms because people take them throughout the year. This is computed by giving the same group of students both forms and then comparing the results. This is important because many students retake them, as I said, to improve their scores. There's another kind of reliability that has really nothing to do with consistency of taking tests over again, and that's called internal consistency reliability, which is one of your vocabulary words. This requires only one administration of the test because you are looking to see how individual test items are functioning together. Are they function homogeneously? Are they measuring the same thing? This is only useful if your test is assessing one major characteristic, like, say, reading. This is not something you would do for an achievement test that assesses more than one subject. So don't be fooled when someone tries to tell you a comprehensive test is reliable by using internal consistency. Popham does not mention inter-rater reliability in this chapter, but it's a term with which teachers should be familiar. When two or more raters or graders correct an objective test, such as an essay, there needs to be a high degree of reliability between their scoring. This usually happens when the raters are trained prior to grading. The New York State ELA assessment is graded that way. If there is a large disparity between two graders for the ELA, a third grader is called in. A correlation coefficient is a term often heard when looking at the reliability of tests. To understand exactly what a correlation is, I used a graph that compares IQ scores with vocabulary scores. As you can see, as one goes up, the other goes up as well. The graph suggests a strong correlation between the two variables. You can see that they center around the line whose slope, in this case, is 1. Goes up, rise over run. It goes up 1 and over 1. This suggests a strong correlation. Anytime you're close to 1, that's a very strong correlation. In this case, you can see they center a line around 1, the line whose slope is 1. In that case, it's a perfect correlation. Very rare if you ever get that. And I've made this graph up, so please don't reference me when you say that IQ and vocabulary correlate perfectly, because I'm sure they don't, but I'm sure they do correlate. When we talk about the reliability of a test, say test-retest, we are comparing the results of one event with a second. A correlation of 1 would mean that everyone who took the test the first time got the exact same score the second time. Of course, we know that's close to impossible, but most tests should have a correlation, which we call an R value, of at least 0.90. A correlation also can be negative. As one score increases, the other score decreases. So instead of the graph going up 1 over 1, it goes down 1 over 1. So the rise is -1, the run is 1. So that is also a strong correlation, but it's a strong negative correlation. Something that you do need to know is that there are sources of errors that make tests unreliable. And this is something that you need to know because you may be going to create tests. The reasons are listed here. Poorly worded questions, questions that are biased. We'll talk about that later. And different interpretations of the wording of a test. So those are things that make it unreliable. So people take these definitions differently. You now know all you need to know about reliability. That's all we need to know. So you can speak about it intelligently in the faculty room when you say these tests are unreliable because poor kids don't know this stuff. That is bogus. You cannot say that anymore because reliability simply means consistent. So if you say a test is unreliable, that means you're saying it's inconsistent, that the results, that the kids that took it Wednesday, if they took it again on Friday, it's going to be different. So that's not what you're talking about. That makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I hear teachers say that. So that's it for this section on reliability. Now I'm going to move into validity. Once we are assured that our test is going to get consistent results, at least within a small margin of error, we need to determine if the inference we can make from the test results are accurate. This is where Popham differs from many educators because he claims that validity has to do with the inference you make about the test results, not the test itself. But whether you consider the test valid or the inferences, the way you compute it is the same. Assessment guru Dylan William claims that the most important part of any course on assessment is the concept of validity. So if you walk away with anything out of this, walk away knowing what validity is and the 3 types that I'm going to talk about. Those 3 types are content-related, predictive, and consequential validity. We will discuss each in some detail in the coming slides. Let's start with content-related validity. And what typically people mean when they say if a test is valid, does it measure what it purports to measure, or as Popham would say, can we make accurate inferences about the curriculum standards that students are expected to know based on the results of the test? I like the way Popham uses the visuals in chapter 3 to represent the concept of content validity. I tried to make a graphic that would give you the same picture. The rectangle represents the curriculum, or in my case, the section on reliability and validity, and these dots represent the 10-question quiz that I made. As you can tell, if all of my questions are centered on one part of the material, say content-related validity, and not all of it, we can't say how much. We can't say with much faith that I can make a valid inference on what you know about reliability and validity. However, if I spread my questions out, you can see how my inferences have a better chance of estimating your understanding. And as you can see, the dots are moving across the broader curriculum, across the broader content. If I add 10 more questions, I even increase my chances of validity on the test. This graphic also gives you a good look at the fact that the more questions you have, the more valid and therefore the more reliable the test is, which makes sense. Content-related validity is usually ensured in one of two ways. One, in the creation of the test itself, or in examining it after it is created. Developmental care means you get a panel of experts together during the creation of the test to first determine what should be assessed, and then second, how to assess it. Makes sense. External review is done after the test is created. A panel of experts is gathered to determine if the questions appropriately measure the content. Now this happens with all our large-scale state assessments, is that there are teachers, curriculum experts that look at the questions and actually create the questions based on the standards. And then after they create these questions and the test is done, another group of experts looks at the test and says whether this is valid, whether it's assessing what we want it to assess. So when you see a question, you say, how could that have gotten on the test? Well, it was your colleagues that allowed it to be on the test. So keep that in mind. The way test makers compute predictive validity, how well a test forecasts future success, is pretty straightforward. They correlate the test scores with the future performance the test purports to predict. Example would be kindergarten screening or the SATs. Do they predict success in those levels? In other words, how does it predict kindergarten success, or how does it predict success in college? Or in the case of the SATs, it really only predicts success in the freshman year, and not that big a part of it, 25%, I think. In my mind, consequential validity, which is the last kind we're going to talk about, has to do with the effect the test itself has on the educational variables of interest. In other words, can the assessment help the learner improve? Or in some cases, can the assessment help the teacher improve, which subsequently leads to student improvement? I use the example of portfolio, which we're not going to get into in this course, which some experts would not call an assessment, to try to make this concept clear. There are three parts to the portfolio assessment, so make sure you put this in your vocabulary in your own words. The collection of material, so how is that material collected? The selection by the student as to what goes into it, and that's what I would recommend in a portfolio, that the student selects what goes into it. And then the most important piece, whether it's an essay, a written piece, an artwork, the reflection on the work itself. You know, and usually it's several pieces of the same artifact, and the reflection is how that improved to get to this last piece. Now, if this is done properly, and this is where consequential validity comes in, the results of this process should improve the student's performance, whether it be writing, art, or something else. Popham claims that consequential validity is more about the results of how the results of the test are used, such as in promoting a student to the next grade or causing teachers to do test prep rather than research-based teaching in the classroom. So there really are a couple of definitions to consequential validity, but I prefer the first one. I would tend to believe Popham, who is an expert on assessment. I am not, although I would say I'm close. My expertise is on teaching and learning, yet I feel strongly that performance-based assessment does improve the learning it is assessing. Much like a violinist who is critiqued by the expert judge, it must improve that person's performance. The last part of this presentation is on fairness, a large portion of which is absence of bias. It's the third leg of the test examination triangle: reliability, validity, and fairness. As educators, we need to be savvy about these terms in order to discuss testing intelligently. It's too easy to quote-unquote badmouth the testing process by claiming the tests are not reliable, they're invalid, or they're biased against certain students. After this presentation in Popham's Chapter 5, you will be able to know if a test is biased against a group of individuals and how test companies go about eliminating that bias. Fairness also considers how we handle English language learners in the testing environment, as well as the assigning of accommodations and modifications to special ed students, which we discussed in a previous module. In the testing world, there are two types of bias normally found in tests that are considered to be unfair. The first test is offensiveness. If a test question is written in such a way that it makes the examinee uncomfortable, then it is considered to be biased in an offensive way. If you look at Popham's sample test questions at the end of the chapter, you will see that the math question uses a man's swastika. Using a man's swastika could be deemed offensive to a certain group of people. I would say most people. The second type of unfair penalization, which means that a test question or test is generally unfair to a group, like gender or ethnicity. Popham used an example of a test question asking the student to write about soccer in the United States. For a non-native born student or a non-athletic student, this could be considered unfair. Another kind of bias is called disparate impact. This is about testing. So if I see in your vocabulary, in your own words, that you Googled that it means quote unquote refers to practices in employment, housing, and other areas that adversely affect one group of people of a protected characteristic more than another, it will be marked incorrect. In the assessment world, it means that after a test is given, everybody has taken it, then there is a subgroup of individuals who scored significantly lower than others who took the test. It doesn't mean that the test is biased, but I would like you to think about that. If you read Popham's chapter, you should know the answer. In the testing world, there are also bias review panels that look at every question in a test. They have a high standard. If a reviewer thinks a question might be biased, then it is thrown out. They also look at the test as a whole. Is there a chance that the way it is written or structured that offends or unfairly penalizes a subgroup? Can you check for bias in your classroom tests? While this is not typically done, you can share your test with another teacher who may be a member of a subgroup and ask her to check it for you. I would think many parents, I wouldn't think that many parents would complain that your test is biased. But if you have done what I just mentioned, you might be able to deal with that issue a lot easier. The last thing I wanted to share with you is at the end of Popham's chapter on bias. He notes that the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for Hispanic Americans makes some recommendations for the assessment of ELLs. The first is a quote not found in the chapter, but very poignant. State accountability officials allow Hispanic youngsters to become invisible inside the very system charged with educating them. The next is that translated tests not be used with ELLs. The reason for this is that most assessments have not undergone reliability or validity testing studies with a translated test. We all know that translation is often open to the opinion of the person doing the translating, and that may not be familiar with that person may not be familiar with the terminology of the test. This recommendation makes sense to me. The second recommendation is equally logical, that the Spanish or whatever language versions of the test need to demonstrate that they are equivalent. The third point that I chose to highlight is that the use of interpreters be discouraged for the same reason that translated tests shouldn't be used. There are several more recommendations listed in Chapter 5, but I felt these three were the most important. So that's it for my presentation. If you watched it all, you are to be commended.